Okay, so since you were originally diagnosed as stage 1A, when did the conversation actually come into play about genetic testing? Because I know for me, I wasn't, the conversation didn't even come up with genetic testing until I was on my third melanoma diagnosis, and it was my second 1B. And a lot of times I feel like it's not brought up unless it's a later stage either. So when was it first offered to you, and then what made you decide to go ahead and have it done?
Yeah. So I remember when I first got diagnosed with it, and then I was like seeing my dermatologist every 3 months, just asking her, like, oh, is that something like I could do? Like, being that I've had a melanoma before, and I only had one, but I had had atypical ones removed in the past. And my aunt actually, right after I went and got diagnosed, my whole family pretty much went and got checked for their skin. And my aunt actually ended up having a melanoma, a stage one melanoma removed as well. So I was like putting it all together and had asked her if that was a thing. And she was like, not really. You were early stage and like it may just be like a one and done type thing, fingers crossed, wishful thinking. But yeah, it was similar. I think it was my second melanoma is when she kind of was like, I know you were interested, and if you'd like, I can put in a referral for you to see our cancer geneticist. Being that it's Duke, it's like a really large healthcare system and they have like a whole cancer center. So she put in the referral through the
Hmm.
cancer center to see the genetic counselor. And it was like in March of last year, I believe. And then it went through in July. So I was just like, kind of like, yeah, I'll just wait until July. But it did take my second melanoma for me to get that referral put in.
Okay. And then were you aware of it, like having been a nurse, were you already aware of it because of that? Or how did you find out about genetic testing?
Um, just like my excessive researching that I do, and like just constantly being on the internet and like finding out as much information as possible. Yeah, I kind of found out on my own. I mean, being a nurse, I knew about genetic testing, but I didn't know like what would
Hmm.
qualify me for it and all of the ins and outs of getting approved for it and a referral, and if that would even be a thing that's allowed for my staging. So I had just brought up the discussion, and then once I got my second melanoma removed, that's when it kind of the ball started rolling with it.
Okay. And then, so I know like one of the reasons I think genetic testing doesn't get brought up a lot, or one of the reasons that people don't really necessarily know about it too, it's not offered to everyone because of like barriers to access due to health insurance, which
Yeah.
I think having had multiple melanomas was something that helped for both of us. But what did the process then look like for you? I know that you had to put in for the referral and it took a while, but did it end up being
Mhm.
covered by your insurance? And was that ever something that became a factor in whether or not they were allowing you to move forward with it?
hmm So I like to this day, I'm like, I am just like so lucky with the insurance I have. Because my husband is in the military, I have TRICARE, which happens to be really, really good insurance. At least for my experience, it's been really good with my cancer diagnosis. There's two types of TRICARE. There's TRICARE Prime, and then there's TRICARE Select. TRICARE Prime, you have to go to like the Army
Okay.
hospital, and then if you want to go off base to like a good research center or something, you need to get referrals, and it's quite frankly a nightmare. TRICARE Select, you pay a very small amount out of pocket. I think in comparison to like other health insurances, I think the most I ever pay out of pocket is like
Hmm.
$1,000, and then everything else is covered. And I don't need referrals or anything. So my dermatologist had just put in a referral basically for them to reach me, but it didn't really need any approval or anything, thankfully. Um, they did say that sometimes insurance kicks it
Okay.
back, but she told me like basically I had to sign a paper saying like if insurance ends up kicking this back saying we're not covering it, I think that my out of pocket cost for it without insurance was like about $200, um, which I personally was like willing to pay because I really wanted to go forward with the testing. So I knew at most I was going to pay $200, but insurance did end up covering it for me, thankfully.
Okay. And that was one of the things that we ended up finding out too when we found out that we were both having genetic testing done at the same time. Because I think you had actually shared like a picture of waiting for the results. And so
Uh-huh.
we actually had our genetic testing done through the same company, which is
Yeah,
really nice because you could track when they actually received it, where it was at in the process, and
I
all of
know,
that,
so
which
nice.
when you're waiting for something like that, it's actually really nice to get those updates. I was
Yeah,
obsessively tracking it, probably more than I needed to.
yeah, yeah. I agree. I feel
Um,
like it was
but
really
I
user
remember too when I actually, yes, which was an unexpected perk. But I know when I was talking to the genetic counselor and we were talking about whether or not insurance companies would cover it and if mine would or not, he actually brought up that they use that specific company because they are so affordable and
friendly.
they set like a cap on it. And so if your insurance won't cover it, there is a pretty low max amount that they will charge, which
Yeah.
is really nice because I find that, especially in the healthcare industry, with a lot of medical testing and things, that does not seem to be the case.
Yeah. Unfortunately, it's not at all.
Thousands of dollars.
Um,
I know, like, mhm.
yeah. Yep.
And so once we found out that we were both having genetic testing, and I want to say it's been a little over a year now, but I want to say we ended up having it done about a day apart. And so
Yeah, it
then we
was
found out that
crazy.
we were waiting for the results. And so it was just really, yes, it was like really close. Like the only way it would have been a stronger coincidence is if we ended up going to like the same clinic the same day at the same hospital. Basically, it was so close together. But it was, I did you know anyone else that had had genetic testing done before that?
No, I didn't know anyone that had it done at all actually. And all of like the people that like I'm friends with and my support groups and stuff online, I hadn't seen it talked about a lot. So I was starting to think to myself, like, is this something I should even be
Mm-hmm.
doing? Like, is this like extra? Like, do I need to be doing this? Or like, why is no one else doing this? And why is no one else talking about this? So it kind of made me question, like, why is no one doing this, and like why am I being allowed to do this? So no, I hadn't known anyone that had done it, so it was really interesting like when you had posted that you were going through it as well, because I was like, okay, I'm not crazy, like this is not me being like really extra and like obsessed with like testing or anything. Like this is a necessary thing, and like there are other people who are thinking about getting this testing done so that they could, move forward with like safer decisions and, know a little bit more about their genes.
Yeah, and the thing that I ran into, so it was really helpful finding out that you were having it done too, because I didn't know it was an option until mine was brought up. And it was 6 years after my first diagnosis because I had a pretty long gap in between my first and then my second. And unfortunately, my second, third, and fourth all just kind of came together really quickly in 1 year's time. But the only people that I knew in my support groups and stuff that had had it were those who had been diagnosed with breast cancer.
Mm-hmm.
And even though there is some overlap in like the BRCA gene is a really common breast cancer one, but there is
Mm-hmm.
some commonality that the BRCA gene can also be linked to melanoma too. But I didn't know anyone with melanoma, especially like in early like stage one or stage two, that had done it. And so with the breast cancer, it was, I didn't feel like it was a shared experience because they were having it done for very different reasons.
Yeah.
And so when I found out that you were doing it at the same time, it was really helpful to have somebody that was, well, for one, going through it at the same time
Mm-hmm.
because there's a lot of shared emotions and we were kind of checking in with each other all the time. Have you heard
Mm-hmm.
back? Where is yours? You could sign into the app and see kind of an update if it's moved on to like if it's out of testing and they're analyzing the results and all of that. So
Yeah.
we were checking in a ton at that time, which was really helpful. But what were some of the emotions and stuff that you felt while you were waiting for those results?
Um, I think I think the what I was most worried about honestly is when I don't know if this was similar to when you met with your genetic counselor prior to testing. But she was really thorough and like really kind of put the ball in my court and like gave me the option like you don't have to do this if you want to do it. This is what kind of answers it can give you. But then she kind of also really went over like I'm just letting you know some of these answers may really affect other choices in your life, not just related to melanoma, such as if you have the BRCA gene. I think she told me the chance of getting breast cancer is like 90%, in which a lot of people decide to go ahead and have mastectomies. And she just really went over like everything with me, not just relating to melanoma. Because at first I was like, oh, I'm just going to get tested for melanoma genes. And then she was really thorough and really kind of went over like, we test for genes for ovarian cancer. And like, if you have a defect in that gene, your chance of developing ovarian cancer is X%, which was kind of scary because I thought I was just going into something and just going to get tested for melanoma
Mm-hmm.
genes, which was really not the case. So I hate to say that like I wasn't as anxious about like having a gene that was like melanoma related, but like truly I was like really really worried about having like a different type of gene related to another cancer because I had like just been grappling this melanoma stuff, right? And like barely pulling it together. And then I was like, my anxiety was like, what if I have something else? Like, I literally will not be able to manage this mentally or emotionally. So it was like, I was definitely fearful of having something that said, like, you're genetically more prone to developing melanomas. Like, obviously, that would not be great at all. But I think I was just really overwhelmed with, like, the fact that, like, I could have unveiled a lot of other information about myself that I didn't know. So I think overall I was just really anxious, but more so anxious about finding out I had some other likelihood of developing another really aggressive cancer. So it was definitely an anxiety inducing instance. And I definitely did put some thought into it after she went over all that with me. Like, do I want to go ahead and do this? Because I am an anxious person. I overthink everything. And being a nurse, I know way too much. So sometimes when I have certain symptoms, I'm like, oh my gosh, like, is this it? So it's crazy, like what knowing too much
Mm-hmm.
and then sometimes when you know too much, it's like it's not a great thing. So I definitely did put a lot of thought into actually going ahead and getting tested. So once I did, I was just kind of anxious to see what the results showed.
Yeah, I know. I mean, I was kind of worried about that too. So when I had my oncologist first bring up genetic testing to me,
Mhm.
it wasn't even something that was on my radar. And we were actually getting ready to do an excision and actually another sentinel node biopsy. So
Mhm.
at the time, I was just kind of like, I'm at my limit for what I can handle at the
Yeah.
moment. So is it something that I have to make a decision right now? And can we come back to it later? And she's like, yeah, absolutely. Like we can talk about it at a future time. And I now see both my dermatologist 3 times a year for skin checks, but I actually see a dermatology oncologist
Mhm.
twice a year as well. So we then went into the discussion again when I had my first of like my 6 month oncology checks, but it was actually ironically my gynecologist had brought it up in between and I was like, okay, this is coming up now in other visits, maybe it's something I really need to
Mhm.
consider. But I have a history of ovarian cancer in my family,
Oh.
and so similar to you, that was my big concern is,
Mhm.
the genetic counselor again was very thorough, talked about the different risks, and we have both prostate cancer and ovarian cancer that runs in my family, and those are all linked to the BRCA gene potentially. And
Mhm.
so when they told me that, I was kind of like, okay, I was not sure I wanted genetic testing at first because I was afraid of what I would find out. But then after a few months, it almost became, well, it's actually probably at this point worse not to know because now maybe if
Mhm.
I do have it and then I can do something about it,
Yeah.
as much as I really didn't like. That was a really tough conversation. Just him saying, your family's history all tend to somewhat be linked to this gene
Mm-hmm.
mutation. So this is something, and he sort of gave me a warning, like these are conversations that we'll potentially have to have if that comes back. And the conversations were like a full hysterectomy, mastectomy, and so I was going into the waiting with that in the back of my mind, like these are
Mm-hmm.
really heavy decisions, and
Yeah.
also kind of I don't know, like it's one thing to continue to have moles removed and having scars and stuff, but I was like, man, like if it comes back BRCA and I have to do like the full hysterectomy and mastectomy, like that's a lot of
Yeah.
just how you identify as feeling like a woman. And it
Yeah.
just, so that weighed really heavily on me during it
Yeah.
too.
Yeah. For sure. I am thankful for like the company because I feel like they were so thorough. They very easily could have just been like,
Hmm.
all right, sign here, let's go over your history and like this is how the process works, you know? And I'm sure there are companies that aren't as thorough. So I was really thankful to have someone who was like actually dedicated to sit there and like talk, it seems like both of us through the risks of what we could find out and like how that would affect our lives going forward. So yeah, I definitely am glad we had similar experiences too, because it seems like it is consistent through that company that we used as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And so then when your results came back, and I know we both got similar results that they were all clear, did
Mhm.
they sit down and have a conversation with you again? And what did that look like?
Yeah, so the at that point the genetic counselor at my cancer center had pretty much just called me, and it wasn't as thorough as like the initial one because there wasn't really a ton it seemed like to talk about. It was kind of just like your results are clear. This isn't, and she really did stress like this doesn't mean that you're never going to have melanoma again, and this doesn't mean that you're never going to develop breast cancer, and
Hmm.
this doesn't mean you're never going to develop ovarian cancer. A lot of majority actually of cancers don't have a genetic component. So like she kind of went over that with me, like doesn't mean like you just stop getting your pap smears and you stop doing breast exams. Like kind of like you're not in the clear, but you don't have a genetic component predisposing you to these cancers, which I was thankful for, but you still need to be very aware.
Yeah, it's still like a relief to know that you're not predisposed to it, but it
Mhm.
doesn't take the place of the preventative medicine and
Yeah,
just getting the regular checks and all of that. Because obviously, what ended up coming back is even though we had melanoma, we weren't predisposed to it, but we still developed that, whether it was
exactly.
from ways that we could have done, better prevention previously, or if it just would have happened anyways. And I think that that's a really important point. Like, it just helps us be able to helps us educate ourselves on where we're at. And then just, if nothing else, really lean into the preventative medicine and control what you can control.
Yeah, for sure. I definitely agree. And just kind of like carrying off that, I had an instance last, and I haven't even like really shared about this, but I had an instance in the fall of like this past year where I was like on a camping trip with my husband and I was freezing. So I like put my hands in my shirt and I felt a pretty large lump. And I was like, oh gosh, here we go again, you know. And with my history of melanoma, I just like started spiraling. And long story short, I had gone to the gynecologist the next day. She was like, this is highly suspicious. Sent me to the cancer center. They did an ultrasound. They scored it like a 4. 5 is like a 4 on the BI-RADS score is like likelihood of cancer, and a 5 is like it's like pretty much cancer. So here they are scoring it a 4 out of 5, and then I went for a biopsy and I was like, oh, melanoma doesn't really go to the breast, but could this be breast cancer? Then in my head, I'm like trying to reassure myself. I'm like, well, my genes were fine. So there's no way it could be breast cancer. I was like using that as a crutch to like convince myself, like,
Mm-hmm.
I can't have breast cancer. I'm 26 and my genes were fine. So there's no way I have breast cancer. So in a way, it like kind of made me feel this like false sense of security. Thank God it was just a fatty tumor, it was a lipoma. But like, talk about a scary 2 weeks. Like, honestly, like the genetic testing like made me feel a little better, even though it was a false sense of like safety, because like I knew like, okay, I could still have breast cancer. It made me feel like at least I don't have
Hmm.
the gene. If I had the BRCA gene, then I would have went completely spiraled. I would have been like, oh, this is it, this is breast cancer. I knew it was coming, so I think the genetic testing in a sense like helped calm me a little bit, even though like we both know either of us can still get breast cancer. It was like a sense of like, well, at least I don't have the gene.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially if it's already coming back and they're scoring it a 4, you
Mhm.
almost, not that you need that, but it would have been very helpful to have something to kind of use as a way to kind of talk yourself off the ledge. Like,
Yeah,
yes, it's still possible that it could be breast cancer, but I don't have the predisposition. It just makes it feel a little bit less likely.
exactly. Yeah, I'm like a
Also, the most
statistic
illogical
person.
thought that, yeah, well, the most illogical thought that I had while I was waiting for my results, because I was so sure that mine was coming back just because of my family's history and stuff. I was like, if this comes back positive, I am letting down my entire family, which makes no sense, right? Because if anything, I'm
Mhm.
actually giving them more information and education and
Yeah.
letting them know that our family has this risk.
Hmm.
And so I was thinking about it backwards, but that was my initial thought. And so I was so worried that I was going to let my entire family down if I ended up
Yeah.
testing positive for a genetic mutation. And what actually, and I think this was really important that the genetic counselor pointed out also when we had our conversation after the results came back, just because I came back negative doesn't necessarily mean with my family's history that there isn't a genetic mutation there.
Hmm.
And I'm the only one in my family who has had testing done. And so they said the more people in your family that get it, the better
Hmm.
data they have to work with. And so they didn't necessarily recommend it, but they said it could be a good idea. And they said, the other thing too is with all of the research that they're doing, even to
Hmm.
have it again in a couple years just to be safe isn't necessarily a bad idea because there's no known mutations right now that are showing up. But
Hmm.
research is consistently finding advancements in both treatment and detection. And so
Hmm.
down the road, there might even be more that they're able to test for, which
Yeah.
not the most comforting thing, but also at the same time, really useful information. And I would definitely recommend doing that company again.
Yeah, for sure. I totally agree.
So you already mentioned you were going to like the Duke Medical System, and
Mhm.
I know you recently moved because of your husband's job. So has
Yeah.
there been any challenges in navigating like your care team and healthcare? Are you still able to see the same care team now that you've moved, or what does that look like?
Hmm. Hi, yeah, yeah. It has been crazy. Half of this office, you can't see it, but it's literally like boxes. um, yeah, it has been crazy. We like packed up our whole life and moved from North Carolina to Missouri. Um, and so it was really challenging at first, but we also knew that this move was coming for like my husband is like on a specific career cycle, so we know when things are pretty much happening. So we knew we would be coming
Okay.
here around this time like 3 years ago. But it just kind of creeped up on us, and then I was like, got diagnosed, and then didn't really think, oh, what am I going to do? And so I think the most challenging thing in aspect in related to that is that my husband and I are going to be moving again in October. So that we're only in Missouri for 6 months. And then we move
Okay.
again. And we don't know where we're moving. He's currently like in this like little interview pool where we get to rank the places we like, and then he interviews and they rank him. So there's a ton of different options on there. And it's like definitely a factor, like Hawaii is one of the options for us to go to live at. And like as someone who's 26, my husband's 27, we don't have kids, we're like, Hawaii seems like a literal dream. Who wouldn't want to live in Hawaii? And the Army's going to pay
Hmm.
you to live there. So, and it's just like a shame that that's like our reality now. Like I have to think like, are there melanoma specialists in Hawaii? And there's not. And it's like, well, is that something I compromise and like I have to fly to LA every 3 months and go see a specialist. Like, is that something I like give up, or is it worth it? Is it worth the risk? So it's just kind of a shame that that's our reality now. But anyway, so knowing that we're moving in October, I knew completely that I did not want to switch healthcare systems now, get 2 skin checks for the summer, essentially. Like I'm due for one in June and then due for one in September, and then move again and switch healthcare systems. Being a nurse, I know how important like consistency and care is.
Hmm.
Like I see every day, like care members not communicating properly, and then the patient's like safety ultimately like suffers. So I've definitely seen that firsthand at the bedside, so I don't want that to be, something that I have to deal with either. So I didn't want to switch providers twice, so I'm just going to, my providers are like well aware of this whole plan I have, but I have a skin check scheduled in June, and then I see my my dermatologist and my surgical oncologist in September. um, so I'm just going to fly out there back to North Carolina for those visits, keep my care with them.
Okay.
And then wherever we move in October, officially switch. Because obviously, we could end up somewhere like Hawaii, and it's not realistic to keep going to North Carolina. So unfortunately, I'm going to have to eventually leave them, which like I don't want to do, because I feel like I just have like very consistent care there, and like it's very cohesive. Um, and my doctor does a lot of like mole mapping, and she's very thorough. I know you mentioned yours was like an oncologist, dermatologist. That's kind of how mine
Hmm.
is. She only sees melanoma patients. So she doesn't see anyone that doesn't have melanoma. So she's like really into it. Our skin checks are like 2 hours long. So like the fear of like going to see someone
Oh,
else
wow.
is like huge. Yeah, she's very thorough. She probably has a picture of every
Yeah.
single mole of my body. So it's definitely a little scary thinking of leaving. So that's why I just decided to keep my care with them through while I'm in Missouri. Just suck up the price of flights, which are astronomical, and eventually switch care, once we find out where we're moving in the fall.
Yeah. And you bring up a great point. Like consistency is so important. And I think especially with melanoma,
Yeah.
there's an extra layer of importance because is a mole changing? Is there a mole that wasn't there before? And that's where mole mapping is really helpful. And it's
Mhm.
not actually available everywhere. I know that's something I'm actually signed up to have mole mapping done for the first time this summer.
Oh,
And
wow.
I had to, yeah, we're kind of on the same track here.
Yeah.
But I am having to see a specialist at a different clinic because actually I go to the university hospital here and my care team is great and I trust them. And but they don't offer mole mapping anymore. They used to, but the person that was in charge of the program isn't there anymore, and it just sort of
Mhm.
fell through the cracks. And so
Yeah.
I'm seeing a specialist, and luckily, the specialist that I'm seeing works really closely and actually trained my dermatologist. And so
Oh,
there's great
wow.
communication there, and we've talked through, yeah. And it's funny because anytime I talk to one about the other, they just rave about each other, but that just makes me feel even more confident in my decision. But we've even talked through like the best way to make sure that information doesn't not get communicated and that I have all the information so I can bring it with me to appointments, not just
Yeah.
the two clinics trying to communicate it to each other to make sure that we're not
Yeah.
losing any of that because trust with your care team is so huge, no matter what
It
it
is.
is, but especially if you're facing a cancer or anything that's uncertain. So
Yeah.
it sounds like you have great communication with your current care team, and um, I definitely would probably do the same thing that you are. Keep my
Yeah.
current care team as long as I can, with
Yeah.
knowing that where you're going to end up ultimately, like in 6 months, is so uncertain.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. Totally agree.
So I have one final question for you, and this is one that I ask everyone that comes on the show. But what is the biggest change that you would like to see in regards to melanoma and skin cancer?
That is a good question. I think that there's such like a stigma around it, and that it's just like, I mean, you see all these things about it like being skin cancer, but it's like so much more than that. um, you see all of these
Mhm.
people like in their 20s, like dealing with tumors in their brain and their liver and their lungs and their bones. And it's just like, it's not just like uh something you can just cut out. And like in our case, like yes, was it something we just had cut out? Like if you want to put it that way, yes, but like it has literally changed our lives and we have to go to the doctor every 3 months and like worry if like, oh, I have had migraines for the past month. Like am I growing cancer in my brain? Like that's like a very valid thought that we have to live with for the rest of our lives. So I think just like ending that stigma of like it just being skin cancer and it's like no big deal and like this cancer is worse, like all cancer sucks. Honestly, it's awful. I don't think any like certain cancer is worse than the other, and I think just like being able to lean on your community is like really important, and educating people as much as possible. Like since I've started sharing about melanoma, I've had so many people message me and say like, I went for my first skin check at like 28 years old and they did a biopsy and it was just atypical, thank gosh. Or I lathered myself in sunscreen this summer. And I actually had a girl message me and tell me that she was on vacation and she got a sunburn and she felt like she failed me. And I was like, oh my God, this is so sad.
Oh,
but like just like one by one, like changing some people's lives can like make a difference. And even just educating people, like not to be like poor me, like this is what I went through, but kind of showing people like this isn't a joke and it's not just some easy fix. It could literally kill you.
yeah, it's all the things really we're educating people on the things that we wish we knew before we had gone
Yeah.
through it ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And I do agree. It's been really cool to see so much education out there this month for, I mean, melanoma is May
Yeah.
is Melanoma Awareness Month.
Yeah.
And I feel like I've seen so many cool things this year of ways that people are sharing education. And it is so important because I feel like people hear skin cancer and they think it's just something that you can cut out. And melanoma is skin cancer, but it's not the type that people typically think of. It really does. It alters the rest of your life. And what sets melanoma apart is melanoma is the one that can travel to anywhere in your body. And I just don't think that, unfortunately, people understand that. And every time someone says, I mean, again, it's really sad when the person's like, I feel like I let you down, but it just shows what an impact that sharing in your story and the education and people are paying attention and it is making a
Yeah.
difference. And it's really helpful to hear that.
Yeah. I totally agree.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk a little bit more about it, especially the genetic testing. It's something that I hope more and more people are aware of, more people have access to, and even consider it as an option to just have a little bit more education about their own predispositions or lack of, and how they can maybe feel a little bit more in control of their own melanoma and skin cancer journey. But for anyone who's listening, whether they want to learn more about your story or just follow you for your dogs like me, where can they find you if they want to connect and learn more?
Oh my gosh, that's a great question. Here I am like wondering what even is my Instagram handle? I don't even know. Let me see. Let's see. Yeah, I love the followers. I do post mostly dog content. That's pretty much my whole life. So it's Jessica and then two underscores Layton, Layton. And then I also have a photography page that is linked to that profile if you guys feel like seeing some of my work. But yeah, kind of like Jen covered, I kind of post a lot of all different stuff, a lot of melanoma stuff and a lot of sun safety stuff, but I try not to overdo it. I post a lot of happy content too, like my dogs, and we travel a lot. So yeah, I love communicating with other people who have kind of gone through this process, no matter what stage they're at. Feel like I finally feel like I have a nice sense of community, even though I haven't met like pretty much everyone. It's important to just connect with people, and I feel like social media is a great way to do that.
Yeah, social media sometimes gets a bad rap, but when you're going through
Yeah.
something like this and maybe you don't know people that are local to you, or just you don't know that somebody that is close to you has gone through it, it's really helpful to not feel like you're going through things alone, which I think
Yeah.
our genetic testing story really lends a good example too. So thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. This was fun.